anyone who seeks satisfaction from the finest experiences in life and isn't easily satisfied with suboptimality, sooner or later begins his quest towards finding his own personal favorite monitor characteristics. So I thought it could be useful to make, in a typical fact-check fashion, an in-depth analytic and database inquiry into this topic. I'm gonna share with you on this channel what I've learned over the years from scope and time extensive first-hand experience with a lot of different monitors, and which together encompass all the relevant specificity of characteristics such as the various sizes, resolutions, aspect ratios, refresh rates, color gamut coverages, and so on. Each particular specification matters. 32 inches and 27 inches are not interchangeable. 4K and 1440p do not look identical. All those things are not the same to me, and if the algorithm brought you here, they're not the same to you. And to get to the next level of optimal purchases, one has to think about every critical variable, such as the ideal number of displays and their orientation for your specific workflow, whether you're pairing your external monitors with a laptop or with a desktop, what resolution scaling you're comfortable with, and how is that influenced by the operative system of your choice. And finally, for the monitors that pass the requirements for your use cases and that satisfy your standards, what's the right monetary evaluation that's considerate of both direct and indirect alternatives of the market to see if a product is actually worth the asking price. But one thing at a time. This video is about monitor size, by far the most glossed over characteristic, but one that has a pretty significant impact on comfort and usability. So let me be your trusted tailor, accompanying you, an intellectual, a soon-to-be a fine monitor sommelier, in your quest in finding the monitor size that just fits you the best. So first things first, it's important to understand why there can't possibly exist just one optimal size for all. This has to do with how our eyes manage to focus objects. There are two mechanics at play here. One is accommodation. Hold up a minute, I didn't sign up for an optometry class. Sure, this is the moment to make a choice, an impactful one. You can pick the blue pill and skip to the takeaways and actionable advice, or take the red pill and hear these revelations. As we were saying, the eye capabilities that are of interest for our conversation are accommodation and vergence. Accommodation is the process of the ciliary muscle that modifies the shape of the lens capsule to change the plane of focus of the eye. Recent studies after the 1970s suggest that our eye's resting point of accommodation, which is the distance the lens naturally tends to focus in absolute darkness, kinda like a default, effortless state, is not at infinity, and actually the statistical distribution that a study measured for 220 college students, some wearing glasses and some not, averaged at 67 centimeters, but had a fairly wide shape. It's comforting to know that the resting point of accommodation is at least in the ballpark of the typical eye-to-monitor distance, but to transform this knowledge from academical into actionable, we need first a way to measure ours, and second, we need to predict as accurately as possible how this will influence our comfort with different monitor sizes. We are actually that lucky, because there seems to be a way to approximately measure it without fancy instrumentation, taking advantage of the so-called Mandelbaum effect. Have you ever experienced looking at something into the distance, but with some sort of interference like a net or wire fence or a spotty glass, like in the rain, between you and what you're looking at? And if this interference is just at a certain distance, your eyes naturally pull focus on it, while this distance is believed to coincide with your resting point of accommodation. We measured ours with the aforementioned Mandelbaum effect, and we got 52 and 33 centimeters. But this is not the full picture, because what is relevant for our discussion is our individual fatigue versus focusing distance function. For this, we also need to take into account the second focusing mechanism, which, according to studies, seems to have an even bigger impact on the visual comfort than accommodation, that is the eye vergence. This is the inward motion of the eyes towards the nose to focus close objects, and conversely the outward motion towards parallelism for the further away ones. This is done for the image of each eye to be projected to the same relative central portion of the retina, and therefore help our brain reconstruct what we're seeing and preventing artifacts like a double image. There is also a resting point of vergence, which does not generally coincide with the resting point of accommodation. In fact, statistically is actually further. According to some studies, it's on average about 115 centimeters. So each individual's anatomy has a determinate resting point of accommodation and one of vergence, and related to those but not necessarily determined by them is what we are most interested in for this discussion, that is the qualitative gauging of discomfort in function of the focusing distance, which is a major factor to take into account to avoid eye fatigue, headaches and general unpleasantness in using the computer. We said we wanted to use this very basic model, consisting of just a qualitative function, to do something useful, to predict how the comfort is influenced by different monitor sizes. Well, I think we can do such a thing. For that, we'll identify and incorporate all the other variables that have a significant impact on the comfort, and we'll ground all this theory with my actual personal experience, which combined will allow us to predict how monitor size preference is shaped and influenced by all these factors. One of those variables/factors, age. Just like your familiar minimum focusing distance, also the resting point of accommodation and that of vergence change significantly during your lifetime, with the tendency of those points to progressively move further and further into the distance as we age, and focusing up close becomes gradually harder and less comfortable. And that explains why, statistically, if you're younger, say in your 20s or early 30s, you're likely to have less problems with smaller screens at closer distances, and actually prefer those if you're also nearsighted. Myopia, after all, is a pretty common condition for increasingly many in this group age. On the contrary, as we experience the passing of seasons, a natural progressive condition called presbyopia that might start to manifest itself from the late 30s, early 40s, consists in the gradual loss of flexibility of the lens, and that results in a progressive distancing of our closest focus. Have you ever seen a grandpa reading a newspaper, stretching his arms? Anyway, taking into consideration the resting point of accommodation and that of vergence, and our estimate on the qualitative shape of the eye strain versus distance function, you'll see that your most comfortable distance is likely to result in the ballpark of 1 meter, which is usually significantly further than what we're used to. So the further away the monitor, the better? Well, there's more to the story. There are some trade-offs and consequences from a further position and consequently ideally bigger monitor to be aware of if you want to precisely identify your personal most desirable combination of compromises. So what we shall call big size when speaking about monitors? In the contemporary monitor market, the term can be reasonably applied to 32 inches. Which is what I'd say is the biggest standard size. Naturally, it can be used for even bigger monitor sizes, and let's also throw into the mix the tempting 48 and 55-inch OLED TVs that hopefully sometimes in the near future will be joined by a 42-inch size, since this panel format was recently announced by LG. Due to the unfortunate absence of sensible OLED offerings in monitor sizes, aggravated by the fact that monitors tend to cost more than TVs when normalizing the feature set, those might be options on the table to consider, but in very specific cases, and I can't stress this enough. Keyword here is conditionality. If you don't want to regret the purchase, you simply cannot fail to make some key considerations. On that note, it was indeed saddening to me to see that a lot of influencers, in my view, misled their audience with their LG-sponsored videos covering the newly announced CX48, mindlessly selling them this tempting idea of a TV for a monitor, inaccurately portraying the actual experience without properly illustrating the caveats. In fact, while for certain use cases, namely content consumption and gaming with a joystick or with a distance peripheral setup, those OLED panels offer an awesome experience. And I'd also mention the transformative impact for video production where they enable a cost-effective way for the general public to grade HDR footage, although with some full-screen brightness limitation. I won't get in depth of the mandatory mention of possible burn-in issues. With the evidence from R Ratings and Vincent Teo, I would estimate that a modern panel to remain essentially burn-in free for a ballpark of 8,000 hours if used at around 50 nits for relatively varied desktop use, with of course all the precautions in place. That's arguably not a lot, and at the present moment, one just needs to make his peace with the fact that OLEDs are not eternal. They remind us of the impermanence of life, so as Lorenzo de' Medici would have said in front of an OLED, chi vuole essere lieto sia, di domani non c'è certezza. That said, if you're using your computer for 8 hours a day, even at well under 100 nits, it might be that after give or take 3 years, you might start to notice some slight uniformity imperfections when testing full screen red. But if you're not doing professional color critical work, I would say that you'd be fine in using the panel up until it gets distracting, which might happen in approximately double that time. What is the cost of pure blacks? In the ballpark of $1,500. Given the limited lifespan, in my opinion it's a little bit too much and just not quite worth it for monitor use. Let's come back to our discussion of size. A situational advantage to big monitors or TVs is for 2 or more people to being able to comfortably watch the same screen. That obviously applies to entertainment, but also to those cases where there is some work that is simultaneously reviewed by multiple people. But excluding those cases, typically big sizes are far from being ideal for desktop use. Let's see why. A major downside is that you can't fit them comfortably on a normally sized desk. Even at typical minimum panel brightness, you might have headaches for prolonged use at such close distances. You should be approximately 100 cm from an anticipated 42-inch OLED, and that translates to say 120 cm desk depth to accommodate the stand and some adjustability leanway, which is the size of 2 standard desks. But there comes another practical problem. Even if you wanted to recreate the visual pyramid of a smaller monitor by placing the TV further away, you might need to position it so that ideally the bottom bezel ends up under the height of the surface on which your keyboard and mouse are placed, for the most ergonomic position. In fact, depending on our posture, looking slightly downward at an angle, you can empirically experiment yourself that it feels easier to focus up close as it is moving the eyes side to side. Whereas when we look straight up at the horizon, it feels more natural to focus into the distance and to move the head side to side instead of the eyes, which can be detrimental to your comfort when scanning the content of your screen. If we think about it, it makes total sense, since we evolved needing to focus on close objects looking down, tinkering with stuff in our hands, while we needed to direct our gaze further into the horizon to spot danger and opportunities in an upright position. So 42, 48 and 55-inch TV sizes progressively need to be placed lower and lower to match the perfect eye pyramid and to maintain the same level of comfort to say more traditional 32-inch monitors. But even this size has its own caveats to be aware of. One of those is comfortable brightness spectrum. Take this for what you will, since a rigorous testing of this is far from straightforward, but from the personal experience of 2 people using extensively a 32-inch IPS monitor as far as possible on a 60cm desk, we found that generally the level of brightness needed not to cause us any headaches when using the monitor for prolonged periods of time has to be under 60 nits, which is fairly dim and not great at overcoming the ever-present yet usually unobtrusive reflections from even non-emissive objects during daytime in an ordinary room with fairly abundant yet indirect natural illumination. And setting the brightness in the whereabouts of 55 nits in daytime, which we typically do, doesn't exactly pay homage to displaying content in the most striking way, especially on LCD panels that don't exactly have the inkiest blacks. Anyway, this panel goes down to 50 nits, which is great in dimly lit environments where the light sources and their reflexes aren't directly visible when watching the screen. But in a completely dark room, 50 nits is, at least for me, definitely a higher than desirable setting. To be noted, this might be extremely subjective, as some individuals might be more or less photosensitive than others. This is again just our personal experience, and although it might even be dependent on the individual panel itself, I doubt that. For completeness sake, I personally experienced a wider comfortable brightness spectrum extended towards higher nit values on my 27-inch equivalent monitor in any environmental lighting condition. But this spectrum is significantly further extended for me on a 21.5-inch monitor. The takeaway is that unless your eyes are not really that sensitive to the absolute amount of light, brightness on a 32-inch monitor can be tricky, or at least is significantly trickier than a 27-inch and below. So if you're shopping for a 32-inch, you might want to check out for the minimum brightness specification of the panel to be ideally at around 35 nits if you happen to also work in a darkroom condition. And also be especially careful that your lighting doesn't produce reflexes to the monitor. On the other hand, maximum brightness for an external monitor is, in my opinion, a useless metric except for OLEDs and mini LEDs, where it's important to showcase how good the HDR presentations are. But for traditional LCDs, once it's over 200 nits, and that's always the case, it truly doesn't bring any additional value for normal indoor use. Next thing to take into consideration for a 32-inch monitor is the weight, and that's relevant because you might want to position the screen as far away as possible on a typical desk, and a potential solution to this is using a monitor arm. And in case you opt for an articulated one, you'll have to spend significantly more for sturdiness, and possibly you might still end up losing some adjustability. Typical 27-inch weight might be just under or on the edge of what most decent articulated arms can handle with ease. As an example, I have a pretty sturdy monitor arm where the last articulation onto which the monitor is attached to is a ball akin to a bigger version of the ones present on tripods, and after tightening the torque of the screws to uncomfortable levels, the 32-inch was still on the edge of not spontaneously starting to drift down, and was kept in a set position just thanks to the slight difference between static and dynamic friction, and any adjustment not accompanied with the care of waiting in a certain position for any micromotion or vibration to stop would trigger the monitor to start slowly tilting down. So you kinda lost the seamless free adjustability with this big monitor size, which ironically sort of defeats the purpose of an articulated arm. This is of course dependent on the mechanical design of the monitor arm, but as a result it effectively narrows down your potential choices when buying one even further, and it encourages you to go beyond just the rated weight capacity and try to simulate in your mind how effective that design would actually be. Of course, if you also happen to move places and need to relocate the monitor from time to time, there's also an appreciable benefit of the size and weight reduction to a 27-inch. Let's also get some applicable takeaways from our brief mention of how myopia should bias your decision. If your correction is around 1, 1.5 and even as far as 2 diopters, and you are in a position where you might just optionally wear glasses for computer use, which is for some a great comfort boost, I would not consider even for 4K 32-inch options, unless there's literally a specific model that checks all your boxes and there's no 27-inch equivalent on the market. Since I'm nearsighted, this is the advice I would give myself from my personal experience. Not that 32-inch isn't a usable size, not at all, but it is just not the most optimal screen size for slightly nearsighted people, in my opinion. Also, if you typically use your computer in a dimly lit environment or in a darkroom condition, in addition to the brightness talk we had before, consider that to add to your nearsightedness, you might experience a condition called night myopia that goes beyond just the effect of having a reduced depth of field due to a more dilated pupil and exacerbates any back focus you had, and has a compound effect by further reducing your ability to focus distant objects, something you might have experienced while driving during nighttime. I want to clarify that obviously I'm not an optometrist, nor a specialist, and neither a doctor of any kind. This video is not meant to give you any eye healthcare advice, rather to take into consideration the relevant vision physiology and distill it into takeaways to be applicable for a monitor purchase guidance. As it is the typical intent for all the content published on this channel, the research is done with the best of our abilities and judgment to find and analyze what we perceive as the most reliable sources of information, and in this case, scientific research, we managed to find. This channel is called Fact Check for a reason. We promote critical thinking and needless to say, we trust you to use your best judgment. This is appropriate because I also want to make you aware of possibly an antithetical argument to picking up a smaller screen, even if you are very comfortable with very close focusing distance. That is that the prevalence of myopia around the world seems to have increased recently, and the environment, and more specifically near work, which includes the use of a computer screen, might be a significant factor, especially if it's not interrupted by pauses and complemented with other activities to relax our eyesight from that fixed close focusing position and to stretch the lens and the related muscles by regularly performing the act of focusing for a wide spectrum distances. And there is a lot of scientific literature on that, and I'm sure it's the subject of ongoing research given the relevance of this topic. To me, it seems pretty reasonable that such a correlation indeed exists. It's also pretty reasonable and expected to see a stronger correlation the bigger the number of hours per day spent doing near work, the higher the general stress, concentration and eye fatigue levels are, and naturally with the lack of complementary activities to give the possibility to look into the distance. How significant would be the difference between this effect between a closer 27-inch to a further 32-inch monitor if we keep the viewing pyramid constant? My guess is that it should be negligible and of second order of importance in comparison to all the other eyesight comfort related criteria we discussed for choosing a monitor size, as if there were a significant one, it then would explode to be astronomical when compared to using laptop monitors, tablets, even reading normal books, and let alone use smartphones. The general scientific consensus I found seems to point out that the prolonged close focusing hours and most importantly the inadequate time spent focusing into the distance to be the main risk factors. But getting back to the topic at hand, then there is the price. Usually 32 inches are about $100–200 more expensive than 27-inch models with a comparable feature set, yet sometimes some high-end features are reserved for 32-inch variants, sometimes for market segmentation reasons, sometimes for technical ones, such as in the case of Mini LED, where I suppose that a higher number of local dimming zones is of an easier implementation for bigger panels. So seems like I listed quite a great deal of potential negatives to the 32-inch size, but more correctly those are just things to be aware of. But remember, making the most optimal purchase is not about counting the sheer number of points or ticks in favor of an option compared to others, but to weight all those points in function of how much the relative characteristics and the impacted use cases matter to you specifically. But now that we talked a lot about 27-inch and 32-inch, by far the most common sizes on the market for high-resolution monitors, before we wrap up, let me tell you an unpopular opinion. If you'd like to have a more manageable monitor size, don't mind small text, and you're okay with getting up close and personal with your monitor at an almost laptop-like distance, if you ask me, contrary to the general consensus on this topic that you might find online, which I find, by the way, mostly based neither on experience nor on sounded inductive reasoning, in principle 24-inch and even 22-inch are also viable even for 4K unskilled, but that applies to mostly young people in the aforementioned conditions, and 22 inches is actually a much better pair to a 13-inch laptop if you want to use the external screen stacked on top of the laptop one. But in reality the market fully embraced 27-inch and up for 4K resolution, and besides the LG Ultrafine and a couple of other now discontinued options that you might find on the used market, or that madly overpriced OLED from Asus, the choice is already made for you and it's 27-inch and up. But if you are content with 1440p, and there are certainly cases where this might be the most optimal resolution for some, there are currently several 24-inch options on the market, but unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, no 22-inch ones. So let's wrap up. 27-inch is generally the sweet spot for most people, and really a jack of all trades, master of some. It's the size that gets a lot of love from the panel manufacturers, so there's plenty of monitors to choose from, and it's definitely the safest option to buy, since there isn't really much that you need to be aware of not to make a purchase that you might regret, as it might happen for other monitor sizes, where you need to consider your vision, your comfortable focusing distance, the lighting of the environment you work in, your budget, and moreover a 27-inch monitor usually fits fine on a standard 60cm desk. If you have no no difficulty or eye strain from focusing relatively up close and you don't mind small text, 27-inch is also comfortably usable even for unscaled 4K. If you are in your 20s and say early 30s with uncompromised vision acuity, and especially if you are nearsighted, in my opinion there is no reason for you to consider 32-inch options other than potentially features that certain manufacturers sometimes reserve for this bigger size. Statistically, your minimum focusing distance at the age of 40 is on average just under 20 centimeters, and that means that your comfortable focusing distance is much further. At that point, I would say the advantage of a 27-inch are outshined by the comfort of a further positioned 32-inch. That means that if you are in your mid to late 30s, I'd preemptively steer my decision towards 32-inch to preserve a prescription reading glass-free monitor experience. And if you are in your mid-40s, well, you age like fine wine and you are now mature enough to take into consideration even those 48-inch beautiful OLEDs, and we might even have the more appropriate 42-inch option in the near future. The relief for your eyes to focus into the distance might compensate all the other potential negatives of this big size. Now, the last major variable still to be considered is the resolution, but that deserves a video of its own, but it can confirm or overturn your purchase decision. And if you're lucky, I've already published our comprehensive analysis of everything you need to know to properly introduce resolution into the equation. And if you enjoyed this video, that one is a must watch because it beautifully complements your monitor knowledge. This is Fact Check, your best guidance for purchase decisions. Our vision is to make analytical, first principle based, hype and sensationalism free videos that don't sacrifice too much of the comprehensiveness of exposition of information for the sake of being extremely YouTube algorithm optimized. If you enjoy this type of content and want to see more of it, express your preference by liking this video and subscribe and enable notifications if you don't want to miss our future uploads. Fact check, never make a suboptimal purchase again.